I love 12 Angry Men. That's not my way of telling you I've joined a large, emotionally volatile same-sex polycule. I'm talking about the drama, 12 Angry Men. Originally produced for television as an episode of Studio One in 1954, remade in 1957 as a film directed by Sidney Lumet and starring Henry Fonda and Lee J. Cobb, among others, fantastic cast, and remade once again for TV in 1997 for Showtime, starring Jack Lemmon and George C. Scott, among others, once again, fantastic cast. Plus, it's been produced for the stage about 1,000,000 times. Chances are quite good, especially if you, like me, live in the United States, that at least one of your local community theater groups has staged a version of it at some point. But of all the many different versions that exist, my favorite is still that 1957 film with Henry Fonda and Lee J. Cobb. Lee J. Cobb, one of my favorite actors ever. And I want to play you a short clip from that movie, actually not featuring Henry Fonda or Lee J. Cobb, because I think it teaches us something very important about the political moment in which we find ourselves, this endless political moment, and how we should respond to this moment in which we are seemingly trapped. If you have never seen this movie, I highly recommend that you watch the entire thing at some point. It is a classic and one of my personal favorites, but for the sake of the clip I'm about to show you, here is really all you need to know. 12 Angry Men is the story of a jury at a murder trial. The defendant on trial is a young man who has been charged with the murder of his own father. The exact ethnicity of the defendant is never specified, but it's implied that he is non-white, perhaps an immigrant or the child of immigrants. He is a poor kid from a poor neighborhood, and because of that, some people on the jury consider him a juvenile delinquent and sort of look down on him because of that. Right before the clip I'm going to play you begins, the jury has taken an informal poll just to kind of see where everybody is standing in terms of verdict, and it came back with 9 votes for not guilty and 3 votes for guilty. And that result represents a major shift in the attitude of the jury, because originally they were overwhelmingly in favor of guilty, and now they have moved to be overwhelmingly in favor of not guilty, with just 3 holdouts who are still voting guilty. And it's at this point that juror number 10, played by Ed Begley Sr., stands up and has something to say, which, if you've been following politics here in the United States for the last few years, will probably sound very familiar.
I don't understand you people. I mean, all these picky little points you keep bringing up, they don't mean nothing. You saw this kid just like I did. You're not going to tell me you believe that phony story about losing the knife and that business about being at the movies? Look, you know how these people lie? It's born in them. I mean, what the heck? I don't have to tell you. They don't know what the truth is. And let me tell you, they don't need any real big reason to kill someone either. No, sir. They get drunk. Oh, they're real big drinkers, all of them. You know that.
I just want to pause it there real quick to note that that first juror who stands up and leaves the table, that's juror number 5, played by the great Jack Klugman. And his character also grew up as a poor kid from a poor neighborhood, like the defendant. So he catches on to what this guy is saying right away.
And bang, someone's lying in the gutter. Well, nobody's blaming them for it. That's the way they are, by nature. You know what I mean? Violent. Where are you going? Human life don't mean as much to them as it does to us. Look, they're lushing it up and fighting all the time, and if somebody gets killed, so somebody gets killed, they don't care. Oh, sure, there's some good things about them, too. Look, I'm the first one to say that. I've known a couple who were okay, but that's the exception, you know what I mean?
There are some good ones. I'm always the first one to say it. What's that remind you of? And some, I assume, are good people.
Most of them, it's like they have no feelings. They can do anything. What's going on here? Well, I'm trying to tell you. You're making a big mistake, you people. This kid is a liar. I know it. I know all about them. Listen to me. They're no good. There's not a one of them who's any good.
There's not a one of them who's any good. So much for there are some good things about them. I'm always the first one to say it. How long did it take for him to drop that?
I mean, what's happening in here? I'm speaking my piece and you... Listen to me. We're this kid on trial here, his type. Well, don't you know about them? There's a danger here. These people are dangerous. They're wild. Listen to me. Listen.
I have. Now sit down and don't open your mouth again.
And that's the end of the bit I want to show you. And just in case you couldn't hear that last line because the microphone wasn't super well placed for that, he said, I have, now sit down and don't open your mouth again. And that was E.G. Marshall as juror number 4. And he is the calm, rational, facts-only guy. And he also, at this point in the movie, is one of the 3 guilty verdicts. So he and the Ed Begley character, the bigot who was just ranting there, are nominally on the same side. But he's the one who speaks up and says, I have been listening to you, now sit down and don't open your mouth again. 12 Angry Men was written by Reginald Rose. And it's his most well-known work and certainly his most frequently adapted and performed work, but Reginald Rose was one of the great writers of the golden age of American television in the 1950s, when it was dominated by these wonderful anthology shows that Reginald Rose wrote many, many teleplays for. Studio One, Playhouse 90, and these were also the platforms on which you saw brilliant work by other great writers of the time, like Paddy Chayefsky, who went on to write movies like Network, and Rod Serling, who would go on to create and write The Twilight Zone. So this was one of the greatest eras of American television in terms of writing, and Reginald Rose was right up there as one of the giants, and his work often dealt with the dangers of prejudice and discrimination and the mob mentality and suspicion of outsiders, and lots of things that Americans were falling prey to in the 50s, and had fallen prey to all throughout history, but were really falling prey to in the 1950s, with backlash to the burgeoning civil rights movement, with McCarthyism and paranoia about communism and those sorts of things. So his work dealt with these issues a lot, and you see that come out very strongly in that scene that I just played you. It's been 67 years since that movie premiered. It's been 70 years since the first version of 12 Angry Men was first broadcast on television, and yet how many times in the last few years, or hell, the last few days, have we heard people on television, specifically Donald Trump, the Republican candidate for president, saying things that sound exactly like what Ed Begley Sr.'s character says in that clip. The words coming out of Donald Trump's mouth are not that different than the words that came out of that character's mouth from 12 Angry Men. The hate, the ignorance, the intolerance, that hasn't changed in 70 years, or a lot longer than that, but definitely in the last 70 years. Hasn't really changed. But the way we ought to respond to it hasn't changed either. Look at how the other jurors responded to Ed Begley's character going off on that racist rant. They stood up, they turned their backs on him, they walked away. And when he kept going and didn't get the message, one of them told him to shut his mouth. And that's what we should be doing to Donald Trump, to J.D. Vance, to their surrogates, to all of the people who represent what they represent. Shunning them, not listening to them, denying them the platform, depriving them of the attention that they crave and they desperately need. Stand up step back, walk away, turn our backs. And if necessary, tell him to shut the fuck up. Rhetorically speaking. Now, how do we do that? Practically speaking? Well, we have an opportunity coming up very soon to do that, practically speaking, in our election. And we do that by voting. By voting for Kamala Harris. And in doing so, voting against Donald Trump. Because the thing is, in real life, Donald Trump is a criminal defendant in several trials that are still ongoing. And he's already been convicted in one of them. We don't know how that's going to turn out as far as sentencing, and we don't know how the other trials that have not yet reached completion are going to turn out. But if we look at this upcoming election as a trial, we have some ability to affect the outcome of it. Because if this election is a trial and Donald Trump is the defendant, his fate will not be decided by a jury of 12 people, but by a jury of potentially about 240 million people. That's roughly how many eligible voters there are this year in the United States. Now, unfortunately, many of those will not vote, and that has always been a thorn in my side. I detest the low voter turnout in this country, but be that as it may, all of us who are eligible to vote have a say in this, have a vote in this verdict on Donald Trump. And if you are watching this and you are one of those 240 million people who are eligible to vote in this upcoming presidential election, I urge you to vote. And I urge you specifically to vote in the presidential election for Kamala Harris. And in doing so, you're not just voting to elect Kamala Harris President of the United States and Tim Walz Vice President of the United States. You are voting to convict Donald Trump. Because if this election is a trial and Trump is the defendant, then the charge he is facing is unfitness for office. And to that charge, the only just verdict is guilty, and the only appropriate sentence is to send him to obscurity where he belongs.